get back to something you were saying yesterday about people going to Wisconsin and voting in the middle of this pandemic, I mean, really putting their lives on the line. And you said, well, if they do that, vote by mail, perhaps we'll have voter fraud in this country. I just wanted to ask you, voters in 5 states, Utah, Colorado, Hawaii, Washington, and Oregon, all vote by mail. Can you or the White House staff or your campaign provide any evidence to back up your claim that mail-in voting is rife with fraud, like the example you gave of people working in rooms filling out false ballots? You've been talking about voter fraud since the beginning of this administration.
Very fair.
And where's the evidence of it?
I think there's a lot of evidence, but we'll provide you with some, okay? And there's evidence that's being compiled, just like it's being compiled in the state of California, where they settled with Judicial Watch saying that 1 million people should not have been voting. And you saw that? Wait, excuse me. Well, I'm just telling you. I'm telling you, in California, in the great state of California, they settled, and we could have gone a lot further. Judicial Watch settled where they agreed that 1 million people should not have voted, where they were 115 years old and lots of things, and people were voting in their place. What I see, and every one of those states that you mentioned is a state that happens to be won by the Democrats. And if you have a position like me where it's registered, you're here, and we're voting someplace where I'm not. I haven't left the White House in, I guess, months, other than to, ask a ship to, wave it goodbye to New York, which, by the way, is now going, as you know, being used for the purpose that we're talking about, which a lot of people wanted. Wait a minute.
Voting doesn't work out well for the Republicans.
Well,
so
it hasn't.
Isn't your concern
It certainly hasn't. But if you're a senior citizen and if you're somebody that needs it, I'm all for it. But they have to be very careful, because the things with bundling and all of the things that are happening with votes by mail, where thousands of votes are gathered, and I'm not going to say which party does it, but thousands of votes are gathered and they come in and they're dumped in a location, and then all of a sudden you lose elections that you think you're going to win. I won't stand for it. Well, we're going to find out about the proof, because you're going to see what's going on. And I'm not going to stand for it. Our voting system, first of all, we should have voter ID. When you vote, you should have voter ID. And if you send something in, you should be sure, as a state and as a country, you should be sure that that vote is meaningful and it's not just made fraudulently, because there's a lot of fraudulent voting going on in this country. This country should have voter ID.
While it's true that these daily briefings now clearly serve the purpose of Trump's campaign rallies, what he still hasn't managed to figure out is that the press is there to hold him accountable for the lies he tells in real time. Meaning that when Trump blurts out that absentee voting is rife with fraud, like he did at the previous press briefing, CNN's Jim Acosta can simply ask for proof and then watch Trump flounder. Now, aside from the initial promise of "we'll get back to you on that," Trump did cite one example of the supposed rampant voter fraud, where he says that, quote, the state of California settled with Judicial Watch saying that 1 million people should not have been voting. Now, Trump is framing this as there having been 1 million people who voted illegally in California, which, surprise, is a lie. What he's referring to is a 2017 lawsuit against the state of California by the conservative group, the settlement of which required LA County to remove the names of inactive voters from its voter lists and to direct other counties to remove inactive voters from their own lists. But there was zero evidence that any of these inactive people voted illegally. And even Judicial Watch itself said that most of them are, quote, voters who have moved to another county or state or have passed away. That's it. In other words, the settlement was not about people who voted illegally or who've engaged in fraudulent behavior, which is why Trump using it as evidence of his fraud claims are complete BS. And by the way, with regard to all of the supposed illegal activity in California, in reality, voter fraud is almost non-existent. In 2016, investigators found 6 cases out of 23.1 million votes cast that were worth sending to local district attorneys. 6 out of 23.1 million. Of course, Trump knows that these claims are ridiculous, but he's not making them because they're factual, he's making them because they help him. With regard to Wisconsin, which just held an in-person election against the will of the Democratic governor, and despite there being a pandemic, Trump was in favor of in-person voting because it favored his party's candidate, conservative Justice Daniel Kelly. I mean, come on, this isn't rocket science. The state closed all but 5 polling places in Milwaukee, the urban center of the entire state. In other words, there were 5 polling places for 600,000 people, and that was by design, because while fewer polling places in rural areas, which typically vote Republican, wouldn't necessarily have much of a material impact, having the entire population of Milwaukee vote in only a few spots meant that we were looking at 3, 4, 5-hour waits to vote, and on top of that, while sacrificing their health to do it. We shouldn't have any in-person voting. We are in the midst of the worst global pandemic in our lifetimes. The last thing that any elected official should be allowing is sending people to congregate in long lines for hours on end in public, much less endorsing it. By the way, aside from his bogus Judicial Watch 1 million people voting illegally claim, Trump also perpetuates this baseless idea that thousands of votes are being dumped in a location so that elections can be rigged. And of course this isn't based on anything, it's just words falling out of his mouth. But this is what he does. He starts conspiracy theories because the point isn't to introduce any factual information, it is to sow doubt in the system as a whole. It's so that if and when he loses in the election, he can turn to his supporters and deny the results, knowing that they've been primed for years to believe that in fact, the returns can't be trusted. That's why Trump created a voter fraud commission to try and justify his claim that there were 3 to 5 million undocumented immigrants voting in the 2016 election, which the commission couldn't find before being forced to disband. That's why Trump claimed that he only lost New Hampshire because out-of-staters drove in and cast ballots there. That's why Trump said that Republicans lost the 2018 midterms by claiming that after voting, some people would, quote, go to their car, put on a different hat, put on a different shirt, come in and vote again. It is all a means to an end. Although I should mention that in recent memory, there has been one notable instance of election fraud. It was perpetuated by a Republican operative to try and steal the election in North Carolina's 9th congressional district. Funny how when Trump was busy insinuating that Democrats were busy dumping out thousands of votes to help themselves, that the only actual instance of fraud was perpetuated by his own party. And look, clearly this isn't about voter fraud. It's about voter suppression, and it's about Trump twisting himself into pretzels to try and justify it. It's about a major political party in the so-called greatest democracy in the world exploiting a pandemic to win. So when Trump says that mail-in voting is bad, it is, per usual, only to help himself and his party win in the next election.